Last week, we spent some time discussing what the collective point was of several different New Testament passages. And did you give this back to me?
I think I did. Let me get once.
There we go. All right. We had such things as, what was Jesus trying to say in John chapter 5? What did the men in Luke chapter 24 have a problem understanding? What was said at the beginning of the apostles' teachings or their sermons in the book of Acts? What were the Bereans searching for? What was Peter's point in 1 Peter chapter 1? And what was John emphasizing in 1 John chapter 1, verse 1? It's not working. All of these passages are taking what has been written in the Old Testament, in certain passages in the Old Testament, and comparing them with words spoken by Jesus, Paul, Peter, and others that were apostles and were eyewitnesses. So everyone must ask themselves these kinds of questions. There we go. Is there a mastermind that created an intelligence, so to speak, or was everything according to chance or accident? Are the words written within the pages of the Bible really the words of that creator? Are the witnesses credible? Are they reliable? And do the witnesses' accounts, the ones that they wrote, match what was foretold? And what we found out was that this is what the early Christians were doing in those passages. They were doing that comparison, and it was important to them. And I think too often, like we mentioned towards the end last week, is that we don't begin there with new Christians. In fact, sometimes we don't have enough in our arsenal to actually make that comparison and know these things for ourselves. But the Bible, as I hope to show throughout this entire class, is full of these kinds of things. Some that are subtle and we don't even realize sometimes. In John chapter 5, the Jewish rulers wanted Jesus to cough up some evidence for their claims, for the claims he was making. They did not think it was possible he could do this. But Jesus used, of course, 6 different witnesses for evidence. He used himself, John the Baptist, his miracles, the Father, the Old Testament scriptures, and specifically the writings of Moses. 3 times the number of witnesses or evidence that he needed in a court of law, according to the Jews in the Old Testament. When the men who walked on the road to Emmaus saw Jesus in chapter 24, they thought that this unknown man was someone that just was either out of town or ill-informed because he didn't seem to know what was going on. But then Jesus opened up the Old Testament scriptures and showed them that they were the ones who were looking at the evidence in the wrong way. It was them, not him. Interpreted correctly, Jesus matched every category. They were amazed, and it says that their hearts had burned within them while Jesus talked to them and opened the scriptures. In Acts, in the sermons of Peter and Stephen, and also implied in some of the other lessons, I believe, was that the two sermons, specifically in these cases, told the Old Testament stories of what happened from a different perspective, so that they would see that they actually did predict that this one that was coming was going to do the things that he did. The claims were that Jesus really was the promised seed of Abraham, the one promised by Moses, the root of Jesse. He was the king that would come from David. When the story was told from this perspective, it was either going to be accepted or is going to be rejected. When Stephen spoke in Acts chapter 8, they killed him for it. But when they talked on Pentecost and Peter spoke on that day, they asked, what are we going to do now? And of course, that's when Peter told them, repent and be baptized. So everybody's got to make a choice, every individual. And the choice needs to be made not on a feeling, but on an evaluation of the evidence. Then, in 2 Peter 1:16 and John 1:1, the apostles both made the claim that they were not following some cleverly devised deceitful stories. They were instead eyewitnesses. They heard, they saw, they touched. And like Chuck Colson that we talked about last week, one of the Watergate defendants that ended up converting in prison, he realized that the people that did this, the apostles, did not waver from their stories for over 40 years, even though they were tortured and killed. In every case, Old Testament scriptures were searched, studied, scrutinized, and compared with what the witnesses saw and heard and touched. Now, I want you to note as we go through this is important. What we have is not something that we can assume that is ironclad, rock-solid proof. Some people call this is proof, this is proof, this is proof. But really it's not. What we have instead is we have a mountain of evidence. And evidence has to be evaluated. And I'm going to show an example later on when we get a little farther in here of a real-life situation that I read in a book of where the evidence seemed to lead, but it wasn't the truth. The evidence actually led a different direction, and that can happen quite often. So God gives evidence. The evidence is overwhelmingly, I think, in the favor of showing that he exists and that he wrote that book. But other people, unfortunately, look at that evidence and they come up with a different conclusion. I think he did that for a reason, but that's a class for another time. So the questions that remain here are actually, let me see if I got the next one here. There we go. So, we said last week that there are a couple of things that we've got to know. Number one, we've got to know that God displayed this evidence in his creation, and he also displayed this evidence in the scriptures that are written. God has presented his case in many different ways, in a wide variety of ways. Now it's up to each individual to be the judge and the jury, so to speak, unto themselves, each individual person. We also said that there were 3 questions that each person must answer as they do this. And these were the ones we talked about. Is there an intelligent designer, and who is it? Number 2, are the words in the Bible true? And 3, was Jesus actually who he claimed to be? And along with that, did he actually raise from the dead? Those are important questions, and those are, I think, are the most important questions in life to ask by anybody, and they have to be. And the way you live and what you do makes a decision as to which choice you make, even though sometimes you don't even know you're making that choice. So, what I want to begin with today, and we're only going to spend a short time. I've done this countless times at this place, and other people have too, where we went into detail for long, long periods of times on what I call outside evidence. Outside evidence to me is things that we see around the universe that shows us whether or not there's a God. I want to deal with that first one first. I'm going to give you a smattering today of some things that a lot of you maybe have seen before. Maybe some of them you have never seen because you haven't been in the classes. Maybe you'll add to what you know, but that's what we're going to do today, is just look at a few of these. So, is what we see in the universe an accident that happened by chance, or did all of this get here by some kind of design? And it's the old argument between intelligence and non-intelligence, or mind and matter. And the evidence, I think, points one way. We're going to take a look at some. We have discussed a lot of these evidences, or what's called apologetics here. One of my favorites, one of the ones I think comes up the most, is something called transitional forms. And you probably have seen this in books or online or magazines, etc., where they start with a primate and work their way up to a regular person that's supposed to be like us today, and that we went through this process. Even in their own terms, they don't tell you this, but that's not really the order of that. The reason why they put the picture in order like that for themselves, if there was evolution, if it was true like this, the order would be different, but they do it in a way so that you see small, big, bigger, biggest, all the way up, so it looks more real to you. So they actually fool you right from the beginning, even though I don't think they're right. They mix it up so it looks better. And they do that with a lot of things, and we're going to see that here in a minute also. So lack of transitional forms is an important part of this. And a transitional form simply means that it is a fossil that is in between a man and a monkey, or in between a bird and a reptile. All right? Some kind of if there's something that's in between there, then there must be a fossil of it someplace in the world. And have they found it? That's what we're asking right now. Since we see various kinds of forms in the fossil record, looking critically at what fossils become and which ones are there becomes very important. As archaeologists work to uncover ancient bones and other artifacts, what do these pieces of evidence show? If they are to show a common family tree, as they claim, then the fossils must show this in the form of transitions from one life form into another. And that's what Darwin thought they would find. They thought at the time, we haven't seen any because we didn't really realize that this was true, so now let's start looking for them, which they've been doing ever since Darwin's time. Here are some examples that they've come up with over the last 150 years. First one, Ramapithecus. You may have heard some of these in school. I know I did. They were in the science books. Ramapithecus, they had a fragment of a jaw and some teeth, and they found about 40 of these. But later they found out that this was an orangutan, so it didn't work. Oh, it gets better than this, guys. Second one was Java Man. Now I want you to notice on some of these I've got more than one picture, and the picture shows what they took, what they had, what they formed, and then what they made out of it. They do a lot of conjecture when they do these things. Java Man was the skull fragment, was a skull fragment, and what you'll notice is it is the, if I remember right, I'm trying to remember if it was the top or the bottom. Yeah, it's the top of the skull, that dark spot on the right side on the top of the skull. You can see it in the display case. They still got it in the display in a museum, and a femur bone. All right, so they got two pieces, and from that they constructed the guy on the right. They know a lot of stuff about him. Although the skull fragment was about 50 feet away from the human leg bone, and before the guy died, he confessed that he had also found 2 human skulls at the same site, and that the skull fragment that he found here was actually a gibbon. One of the more famous ones that I remember, because it happened shortly after I was out of high school, about 5 years after I was out of high school, and it was like big news, was Lucy. How many remember when Lucy came out? Yeah. This was Johansen that discovered it in Ethiopia in 1974. Very complete skeleton. The key part of this one was the knee bone, okay? Because how something stands up straight or doesn't stand up straight makes a difference as to whether or not they're considered human or whether they're considered something before that. But unfortunately, the knee was, they found this out later, the knee was found over a mile away from the rest of the skeleton parts and about 200 feet deeper than the rest of the bones. That was never brought out. Lucy is still on display as this is one of the missing links, and is now said to be a mosaic of probably 2 or more creatures, but it's all they got. Piltdown man, human skull and an orangutan, a human skull and the jaw of a orangutan was doctored up. The teeth were filed. They know it was pure fraud. If you try to look that up in a science book, that one's gone, because that one's a definite, like, there's file marks on here. And they didn't know it until they had a better microscope and could actually check years later, and they found out that it wasn't real. Everybody remembers the Neanderthal. They were stooped over. They could tell from the skeletons that they were stooped over. But later on, some people from Johns Hopkins that studied them said that they were probably just humans that had either arthritis or rickets. But on the left, in that small grouping there, beside the bones, on the top in the middle, you see what more modern people have made him out to look like as far as a ancient pre-man. But there was actually somebody, and I forget the name of the person that did this, that drew him another way, so he actually looked modern. In fact, the guy at the bottom, he actually was a guy that kind of looked like that, and he kind of dressed in his hair and his facial and whatever, and dressed up in his suit and went on to the subway in New York, and nobody actually recognized him as Neanderthal. So they make up a lot of stuff when they do this. This is an important one here, really important. Nebraska man, okay? It was made up from, you see the upper left? That's a tooth. The only thing they had to make up Nebraska man was a tooth. One tooth. Now, it's important to know that this tooth was found in 1917. It was said to be a missing link in 1922. I think this was either one of the first or maybe the first that they found. I can't remember for sure. By 1925, what's the important court trial that happened in 3 years after they declared this as the missing link, this tooth? Scopes monkey trial, which basically headed this whole country in the direction of evolution. Read up on it. I've talked about it before. It's a really important trial in this country. They tried and they succeeded in some ways, making Christians look like fools because of what the new prevailing thought was on evolution. And to this day, it is stuck. It is what we're stuck with because of what happened during that trial. It was based, one of the things it was based on was this tooth. And then by 1926 and 27, they found out it was a pig's tooth. I kid you not. Okay? That's how sneaky these people are. We can go to the animal kingdom. This is one that is pretty famous. It's, if I can pronounce it right, Archaeopteryx. Thank you. I practiced. They claim that it's a half bird that was being changed into a dinosaur or some kind of a reptile. But basically, there's a lot of scientists that say this is just a bird, okay? Yeah, there's some features that are a little bit different, but it's a bird. We've got tons and tons and tons of fossils of various species. So we've got fossils of people, we got fossils of all kinds of the monkey and ape and whatever kingdom, and I can't see that because I'm not, was that bird next or reptile? Reptile. We got the tons of various reptiles in the fossil record. We got lots of fish. Even back, we've got very small organisms with very few cells. There's fossils on all of those. But what don't we have? We don't have the ones in between where the changes would be. Now, they'll claim they do, but I've actually watched scientists being questioned and they contradict themselves because they know they're not there. They don't have them. Otherwise, they'd be plastered all over everything, and they only have a very few, and the ones they have are either questionable or, more than likely, as we've just said, out-and-out frauds or wishful thinking. Yes?
If there were, there would be more of those than there would be of the fossils.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you're going there now, but with those, there would be more mistakes than successes, and so they should just be found.
We got tons of the actual fossils of actual things we see. There should be, like Bill said, there should be like hundreds and hundreds or maybe even more times many of the in-between ones as it made those changes, and they're not there. They should be easier to find.
Are you going to talk about Cambrian and pre-Cambrian?
No, I'm not going to get in. That's for my long class.
Okay.
All right, I've got a year-long class on this. This is one day.
Okay.
I'm just getting us into what we want to study. I had to really cut this down to get to even get it to one lesson. The next thing I want to talk about, and I think is important, is something called symbiotic relationships. And we have mentioned this in some classes before. I know Nathan did at one point. The one I mentioned in a class here a while back was the dentist fish and the barracuda. The dentist fish has to eat stuff on from the barracuda's mouth, and the barracuda has to have his teeth cleaned. Otherwise, neither one of them can survive. The question is, how did that happen over long periods of time by accident without killing a lot of dentist fish and a lot of barracudas? Okay, it's like impossible, it seems to me, to be able to evolve that way because they both had to be in place at exactly the same time. Same thing I found this time. I just started looking this stuff up. There's a little bird called the Egyptian plover. It's called the crocodile bird. Crocodile gets all kinds of decayed meat between its teeth, and guess what eats it? That little bird. It's the only thing the crocodile won't eat. And the one at the bottom, same thing with sharks. There is a dentist for the shark's teeth also. But we can see this kind of relationship in other areas. For instance, has anybody in here ever watched the Bee Movie with their kids or grandkids? You know what I'm talking about? Yes. I actually kind of like that movie a little bit, you know. The Bee Movie makes a point to show that if you don't have bees doing their job, you don't have flora. And in the cartoon sort of thing, it's a movie that's cartoon based. Everything dies, and the bees have to come back and save the day. Well, this is actually truth. We wouldn't have flowers without the symbiotic relationship between insects and those plants. They have to be there at the same time. One can't lead into the other through long, gradual periods of time. Also, fungi provides protection and moisture for algae, and algae nourishes the fungi to keep it alive. And a biology textbook puts it this way: neither population could exist without the other. The same textbook that says evolution has to be true. Do you see how it doesn't always make sense what they say? They're not thinking through it, or they're hiding something. And the ultimate one is simply what Nathan brought up here, I don't know, it was a week or two ago or so. Simply the circle of oxygen, carbon dioxide that we breathe out, they breathe in, plants, they breathe out, we breathe in. Without that, we couldn't survive. plants couldn't survive without bees, they can't survive without us. It's kind of a closed system. How did that happen if it was gradual over a long period of time? These are all included in a larger context of something called the mousetrap analogy, if you've ever heard of it. The idea is that you take away one piece of a mousetrap and it can't work. It has to be assembled specifically at the same time in a specific order or it won't work. All right? How much more complex are we in these systems that we're talking about? Think this through a little bit, and what they're saying really has a problem making sense. It must be assembled in order, and what we call this, as we're going to see in just a short 5-minute film here in a second, is irreducible complexity. I knew I was going to get that eventually. The idea that it is so complex that you can't reduce it by any one particular part or it won't work. One of the things that has kind of taken by storm is in recent years that shows this. Michael Behe is a doctorate of cell biology. I don't know if that's his exact title, but he's pretty famous, and he's wrote some books. One of his most famous books, I think is really good, is called Darwin's Black Box. Darwin opened up the idea that the cell was the key to making these little changes. But when Darwin wrote, Darwin didn't have any idea how complex the cell was. And then when people started studying the cell, they had a problem because it didn't match what evolutionary process was saying. And Behe is one of the most profound advocates of that in recent times. Take away any of the pieces and it doesn't work. One of the ones that he talks about quite a little bit is called the cell flagellum. And the cell flagellum is a part within a cell that actually makes it mobile. And on the right, that little picture is an actual drawing of what that kind of thing looks like at a submicroscopic level. And on the left, it is what it is made up of, and they know and they can see what it's made up of. And this short film here gives us an idea of what Behe is talking about. In fact, this is, he's older now, and this is Behe actually in this film. So it's not coming up. It did just a minute ago. Okay, I had to click twice. I didn't think we had to do that.
We all love cars for their beauty and performance. But except for guys like these, not everyone really understands what's inside. Is this what you're looking for?
Not even close. You could stand over there.
Oh, okay, I'll just stand over here. In a way, cell biologists are like auto mechanics. Each cell has an astonishing number of intricate parts, way more than any car. We study what the parts are, how the parts work together, and even which parts of the cell can be left out without causing too much harm. If you understand the inner workings of the cell, you can understand a lot about all living things. What makes them thrive, what makes them fail, and what causes them to evolve. We'll cover more about that later. Right now, I want to look at the topic of complexity. You and I are made of about 40 trillion cells. They comprise every part of our complex human anatomy. But the truth is that we can reduce the number of parts and still have function. If we lost an eye, an ear, or a hand, it would be very unfortunate, but our lives could go on. The same applies to this rather complex drill. It has some cool add-ons, but I could take off this battery gauge, or this LED light, or a few other gadgets, and I'd still have a working drill. But How far can I reduce its complexity and not ruin it? I don't want to take apart my drill, so let me move to another example. This mousetrap. The complexity of this machine entails 5 parts: the platform, the spring, the hammer, the holding bar, and the catch. Now, if I reduce the number of parts from 5 to 4, if I take away the holding bar or the spring or any other part, it wouldn't work. Every part is essential. I call this irreducible complexity. So does this apply to biology too? Do we have examples of irreducible complexity in life? Try this one. Here's a bacterium, a single-cell microbe. Some bacteria have a flagellum, which is like an outboard motor on a boat. It rotates to propel bacteria through liquid, and it's necessary for their survival in order to swim to search for food. A flagellum has a number of parts: a drive shaft, a universal joint, a rotor, bushings, stator, even a clutch and braking system. The motor of the flagellum has been clocked at 100,000 revolutions per minute. And as with the mousetrap, removing even one component of this elegant machine destroys its function and renders the bacterium, shall we say, dead in the water. The flagellum is irreducibly complex. Now we know that this was assembled in a factory, but how is the bacterial flagellum developed in nature? Keep in mind, the flagellum is irreducibly complex. All the parts have to be in place, or it does not work. Could it have been developed blindly, in stages? Let's say in the distant past, the bacteria first gained a drive shaft. Later on, a rotor. Then a stator, and then the rest. Then the parts got in sync as a high-performance engine. The theory of evolution tells us that given enough time, any organic structure we see today, no matter how complex, could have slowly and fully developed by random, unguided forces. We'll come back to the topic of complexity in our next video, which will examine the power of evolution.
The next one I want to speak to just for a moment here is one of my favorites. I have a talk just on this. In fact, I know you've heard it before, right? The shoebox and the camera and that sort of thing. I mean, I do a whole half-hour, 45-minute talk just on this. But the human eye is indeed an enigma to evolutionists. In fact, these are the words of Darwin. To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. The belief that an organ as perfect as the eye could have formed by natural selection is more than enough to stagger anyone. The real problem with this is they didn't even know, I think, at his time that humans have one kind of eye, and there are animals that have very similar ones, but there are animals that have very different eyes. So what we're talking about is not the eye being invented once and everybody using it. There are other organisms that have totally different ways that the eyes had to have been accidentally come about in a lot of different ways in order for it to even work. Something that Darwin didn't even know. I'm not going to go into this because I just don't have time, but of course the DNA is a real important one also. But I think where am I at here? Yeah. I think one I want to spend a little bit of time with, hope we got enough time to get through this, is the idea of something called the first and second law of thermodynamics. And I'm going to try to do this as quickly and easily as I can, not to get scientific with it. How many in here ever saw Pirates of the Caribbean? Yeah, good. Hey, I got one that almost everybody saw. Johnny Depp, of course, plays Captain Jack Sparrow. And they make it a point throughout the film to talk about something called the Pirate's Code, right? And it's something that can't be broken. But at one point, Captain Barbossa, who is the enemy in the first one, tells Elizabeth Swann, when she makes a request according to the code, he says that the code is more of what you'd call a set of guidelines instead of actual rules. I don't know if you guys remember that or not. Then he proceeds to break the code because it's in his favor. This is not true with scientific laws. They cannot be broken. They are not suggestions, okay? And these two that I'm talking about are rather important and fundamental. The first one, called the conservation of energy, states that energy can be converted from one form to another, but the total amount of energy always remains unchanged. We used to say it this way in a shorter fashion: energy cannot be created or destroyed. A simple example of this is if you have a fire, you start with a log, and you light it on fire, the log disappears. Does it? Not really. It changes form. The energy goes from a log into ash, gases, and smoke, that sort of thing. So it still exists, it just exists in a different form. And what that implies is energy changes forms, but it never disappears, which means it can't be created. You can't create something brand new from nothing, and you can't destroy something so it no longer exists at all in any form. So for the evolutionary thinker, this is something that they have to work with as a, how can I put this? They have to be able to work with this as one of their tenets. So, outside forces or intelligence never exist. If they never exist from eternity, then matter must have always existed. You get the idea? If there was no brains that happened in the first place that could create matter, then matter always had to be here. In fact, I remember a kid in high school that used to say he was turning evolutionist at a ripe old age of about 15 or 16. He said, ether always was. And that was his saying for saying that that was the first matter. Ether always has been here, and there's never been a time when there wasn't ether. I like to use the word rock. Rocks had to always be here, and we're going to see that in just a second. Matter can't just go poof. It can't just like come into existence and go out of existence. Not possible. Therefore, evolutionists must start with matter and can only make minute changes over time. It's called uniformitarianism. Non-intelligent matter always existed, has to be their premise. The second law of thermodynamics says that although the total amount of energy or matter in the universe is always the same, there is a tendency for it to become less available for useful work over time. The technical term is called entropy. Now think of a pendulum. If you start it out here and it starts swinging, what eventually happens to that pendulum? Less and less and less and less till it's still, okay? Energy degrades over time. Important concept. I had a shiny new bike once when I was a kid. Did it stay shiny and new as I got older and older? Or even our cars? You know, does that happen? No, they degrade over time without more energy being put into them. The second law of thermodynamics says that they're not going to get better. They're going to get older and less functional over time. Something must act on this kind of a closed system for it to go in the order from disorder to order. The problem is that In order for atheistic evolution to be true, small incremental changes in what we call uniformitarianism must be able to make changes that are for the benefit or the survival of what's going on. In other words, things have to get better. You go from an amoeba to a fish, things got better. The second law of thermodynamics kind of says that can't happen. But they say that it can, and they give all kinds of mumbo-jumbo reasons why they think it can. It makes it impossible for such thing as a bird's wing to gradually change into lizard legs for the benefit of the reptile family. There are all kinds of these examples that break this law. Now, my absolute favorite of all time, and it kind of relates to all of these in a way, and this was probably the one argument that I eventually came up with that made me know this can't happen, okay? Evolution can't be true. This was my aha moment. When we look at the evolutionary process and we go back, what they did in the monkey trial and what they have done for most of the time when they talk about it to young people in science books is they make the comparison between a human and a monkey, okay? Without the idea of knowing, of stating that this monkey had to come from something else, and all the way back to, what's the beginning again? In their closed system? Before that, Terry? If you started with a single-cell organism, I might give them some credit. But they can't start with one. They have to start with a rock. They have to start with ether. They have to start with something that doesn't have a mind, doesn't have intelligence. And the question is, if that's true, then where did that intelligence, that consciousness, that feeling, that intellect, that understanding, and that thought, where did that come from? That's an important question. Anybody know the answer to this? I did an entire series on this about 20, 30 years ago. It was in a VBS class for like 4 or 5 days I did this. Anybody, Bill might have been teaching. Might have been anybody here that was in that class.
Blind chance?
Okay, I think therefore I am. What is it that they have to say? They have to say that anybody's mind and thought and feelings and all that stuff is simply a chemical reaction that happened over time through chemistry and electricity. That is the basis of where you get your thoughts from. This is the basis of AI nowadays, artificial intelligence. They're looking for a way to do that, and that's what AI is so important to them for. Just a second. That is the very basis of a lot of psychology. It's the basis of education. You wonder why these people are feeding stuff to our kids? We think that it's stupid, but this is what they think. They don't think that the people at the top that are writing the rules, I'm not talking about individual teachers per se, they are taking what was said, they're taking this kind of a thought process that there could not be thought in the first place. There could not be an intelligence. Therefore, chemicals, electricity, etc., have made this happen over time. So now they can take like a cookie cutter recipe and they can put just enough flour and they can put just enough milk, just enough eggs, sugar, come out with the perfect cookie or the perfect kid or the perfect society. They don't think about this the same way that we do, guys. They're starting from a totally different premise. And it's all around us, and sometimes we don't recognize it. Go ahead, Bill.
So you use the term uniformitarianism, and just to clarify that, their premise is that there's nothing that is happening on Earth that hasn't happened in the past. Everything has to be, there cannot be any exceptions to any rules. So like the worldwide flood, they kind of deny that because it couldn't have happened, because it's not happening today. And there are evidences of things that show that there are times there's a completely frozen woolly mammoth that was standing up with food halfway swallowed that was frozen instantly.
That's part of my bigger class. You're right. There's There's hundreds, there's so many of these examples. I'm only touching just a slight surface, guys. I'm trying to get us to the point where we actually understand what's at stake here, all right? There's an article I read not long ago, and that's the title of the article up there. An atheist reveals the scientific and historical evidence that converted him to Christianity, all right? His first two were human DNA and cosmic fine-tuning. That's supposed to be an E on the end of there, okay? I'm one letter too big, okay? Went from, or too low, yeah, D-E, right? It's supposed to be an E, fine, not find. I just now noticed that. So, these are things that would be what we call the external type things that show us and point us, I believe, to a creator, or at least an intelligence that happened instead of an accident. We take the speed of light, we take the Earth's electronic forces, the thickness of the Earth's crust, the expansion of the galaxies, the position that the Earth is in the planets, the water vapor in our atmosphere, gravity, a million other little things that if we take and have them off by just a little bit, life doesn't exist, okay? That's cosmic fine-tuning. And then the other two things that he mentioned in the article are just as important. He says biblical accuracy and evidence of the resurrection. So what do we have here? We've got the scientific, on the one hand, that converted him, got him to God, and the historic accuracy of the Bible and what I call the internal evidence from God's Word brought him to knowing that God was the right one and the God of the Bible was the right God. I think this is a process that everybody in some way or another has to go through in order to see what's going on. So we're going to skip over a little bit of this, which was filler anyway. I didn't know whether or not how long this would take. And I'm going to skip through a few slides because some of this is going to come up again in another spot later on. Thomas Jefferson once said, "Question with boldness even the existence of God, because if there be a God, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." And that's a lot of times what the evolutionist looks at the Christian and says, they just got blindfolded fear, okay? They just think that something's going to happen, so they have to have something to comfort themselves. I agree more with Thomas Jefferson, even though he had some flaws in this area also, but I agree more with this statement that we're supposed to look at these breadcrumbs that God kind of put all over the universe and inside of the Bible and see which side the evidence points to. We're supposed to use what he calls the homage of reason rather than blindfolded fear. And I think that's important. The idea that I'm trying to convey today is that at every step of the process, God has built in evidence that demands a verdict. And this is a book by Josh McDowell. It has tons of it. It's a very thick book, especially you want to look at his volume 1, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, volume 1. That's what it's about. And it's not a book that you just read like a story. It's lists on every page. Lists and lists and lists. I mean, he packs a ton of stuff in a short period of time. And like I said, there are breadcrumbs everywhere just waiting to lead us to the correct conclusion, to look at the evidence the correct way. And that's the way God made this universe. Now, we're not going to spend any more time on it than this, even though this is one of my favorite subjects, maybe my favorite subjects to discuss. And if there was enough interest, I would do a longer class on this again sometime. My point was, I want to get us to the fact that we can look at that there was a creator and be all confident that that's where we're going off from this particular premise. What we're going to do next is we're going to start looking at the internal evidence in the Bible. And before I get to the actual topic, I've got a couple other lessons where we're going to hone in on some more of the unusual evidence that we find than what we are usually study in a Bible class. So next week we're actually going to watch a film that's going to be about 35 minutes long, but I find it very interesting. So bring your popcorn. Hopefully you won't fall asleep. We really don't have time for questions. I apologize. Didn't think it was going to take this long. I only had 7 pages instead of 8 this time, so I thought I was good. Thanks.